Welcome back to Where Do We Go From Here? I'm your host, Kim Kotis, and joining me now is Don Carson, who is also a veteran, and Don is a veteran of the United States Navy. Don, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your career in the Navy and where you're from and a little bit about your life.
Well, I'm from a little town north of here called Hesperia, and I was raised on a farm up there. And when I was 3 years old, I remember that my dad went to the Second World War, and he was captured at Bataan. And still bothers me.
Oh, I appreciate that.
And so he came home in 1946. So I decided I was going to join the service when I got out of school. I graduated from Hesperia High School in 1957, and I joined the Navy because nobody in my family had ever joined the Navy. And so when I got in the Navy, I enjoyed it very much. Boot camp I didn't like so much, but it was all right. You learn a lot.
Sure.
And then I went to Propulsion Engineering School, which is learning to operate and repair marine boilers. And then I went on board ship, and from there I went to diving school and became a second-class diver. And then when Vietnam was starting to crank up in '58, they sent me to Indian Head, Maryland to Explosive Ordnance Disposal School. And from there, I went on aboard another ship and then was sent to Vietnam in 1958.
In '58, and people don't think that Vietnam was going on, but there had been the French involvement, and we were allies, and probably in support capacity. Tell me a little. Tell me a little bit about your training and how that affected your sense of seeing the Navy as a career.
Well, I think it was more the comradeship. You know, when you serve with somebody in combat, it's like you're closer than you are to your own family, because you live with them, you eat with them, you sleep with them, and you depend on them every day, every minute of every day. You depend on them to stay alive. And so you get really close, and you get to know them really well.
Well, and also in enlisting at the time, you were able to see that your career in the Navy as learning some specialized skills and being able to serve in different capacities rather than just on a ship or in a support role.
Right.
Was that something that you found rewarding?
Yes, very much so. And it was, I think probably the biggest reason what made me finally decide to actually stay in the service was I had enlisted for 4 years in 1957. And in 1961, I was due to be discharged. And they just simply handed my orders back and said, "You're extended for the duration."
Oh, so you had almost like a stop-loss thing back then, huh?
When I got out, I had 18 years in, and 2 more I could retire, so I stayed. And I'm happy I did.
Well, what were some of the situations that you were posted? You mentioned you were on different ships. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other training or experiences that you had in the Navy?
Well, we went down to a place called Johnston Island down toward the equator, which is where they tested an atomic bomb. Yeah, we got to participate in that. And it's a little island about 1.5 feet above sea level.
Nice.
It was. And the only thing we do is go to the north end of the island and play softball. There was nothing else there. No trees, nothing. It was a terrible place.
Oh my goodness.
But we got to watch them set off the atomic bomb. At 1,600 feet it went off, and all you could see was this big bright ball and then these ice blue rays. Looked like they had stars in them coming down.
My goodness.
And you could see the bones in your arm. You had to cover your arm, put your arms over your eyes. And
You wear specialized eye protection.
yeah, they didn't give us them. The officers had those.
Oh, how about that?
So you could actually see the bones in your arms when that thing went off.
My goodness.
And then I was at Point Magoo Naval Air Station as an accident and criminal investigator. And John Wayne came there. He was making the movie The Green Beret.
Oh yeah.
And he wanted to work out in our top security area. So I had to escort him every day.
How about
out
that?
there. So him and David Jansen,
Sure.
and I got to meet him, and Kirk Douglas came down to visit him, so we got to meet him.
So you got some biggies there, yeah. David Jansen, for those who don't remember, was the star of The Fugitive and also was acted in various other capacities.
And then Glenn Ford came there all the time to the exchange. He's a retired Navy captain.
Well, that's
So we
great.
saw him a lot.
So
That
what was
was-
it like working with the Duke? I mean, was he a pretty decent guy to work with?
He's just like somebody you knew all your life, you know.
That's good to hear.
He came in and to the security building and he said, "Hello, I'm the Duke." And I said, "Who?" He said, "You know John Wayne." I said, "Yeah, I know." And one day we were working out there, and well, we were sitting there watching him do this movie. And it was getting close to noontime and they were breaking for lunch, so I invited him to my house for lunch, you know. Well, my wife had peanut butter jelly sandwiches, so it's a good thing he didn't come. But he had to go to the Admiral's house, so. But he's just like an everyday guy, wonderful guy.
Well, I think that's important to realize that, you know, we see people, whether they be actors or musicians, and sometimes people look up to them or idolize, but down underneath,
Yeah,
they're just a regular human
yeah,
being. You know?
everyday people, you know. They happen to have a special talent to be able to do this acting. And
Right, and I would imagine there's a certain amount of humility. He was probably curious about your work, and so when he was in that role, he wanted to know what it meant to be there.
he was a huge supporter of the veterans.
Absolutely.
And I got to be in the movie In Harm's Way,
Oh yeah, I
which
saw
was
that.
again with John Wayne. But I didn't see him there. I was on a destroyer, and they paid us $10 apiece to jump over the side when the ship was supposed to be sinking. So we would jump over, swim around, get on, and jump over again. You know.
Now, were those ships that we would see in these war scenes? Were those things that were mothballed ships? Were they ships that were out of commission in a sense?
Well, like our ship was active at the time. You know,
okay.
that when they did it, they shot some of the scenes in the engine room were shot on board our ship, and it's really fascinating to watch them because they all came down in the engine room. The engine room on a destroyer is very, very crowded. You know, there's just no room to do anything. And when they got all their cameras and everything, they decided it was too crowded. They couldn't film what they wanted to film. So they went up on the fantail of the ship, and they built this entire engine room.
How about
And
that?
you couldn't tell the difference. Built all out of plywood, and you couldn't tell that they weren't really in our engine room.
Because they need lighting. They have a director. They have all kinds of
yeah.
people on the set. It's not just, you know, like you mentioned. These are cramped quarters
Oh yeah.
to function in. So yeah, you got to see some of that behind the scenes.
Yeah,
thing.
that was really interesting. I enjoyed that.
Well, you know, there's always been a pretty good collaboration between the services and Hollywood per se, because they want people to get a real depiction of what life is like in as much as they can.
Right.
But at the same time, the actors and people who are working in that get to know that they're people who are really dedicated servants. You know, they're people who are, you know, veterans, or people who are really dedicated to their role. What were some of the other specialized duties you did? You mentioned prior to going on camera that you worked with some Korean folks with their military.
Yeah, it was called Naval Advisory Group, and we went on board their swift boats, which they had their own, and taught them how we operated ours, and how we fought, and how we stayed out of trouble, and how we went into trouble. And that was basically our job, to train them. And of course train them on the weapons, because they were using our weapons.
Now, did members of the South Korean military serve as allies with us in Vietnam?
Oh yes, yes.
I think that's kind of an unknown story.
Yeah.
That there were some other countries that were allies
There
with
was
the
a lot of
Americans.
countries there. There was the South Koreans were there, the British were there, the Australian, New Zealand. There was a lot of countries that
Were the
that you never heard
Filipinos?
of.
Were the Philippine
They
military
were
law?
limited, the Filipinos. They have some law that doesn't allow them to send combat troops,
Engaged in combat?
as Japan has the same law.
Yeah. Well, was there a lot of other support services in terms of supplying and
Oh, yeah.
other types of things that?
They did a lot of supplying, flew a lot of helicopters in there.
So did you go to Subic Bay and
Oh, yeah.
various
Been
ports?
there many times.
Some of the ports around the South Pacific, or even
Yep.
in Korea.
Subic Bay in Hong Kong, and went to